Infinex could be blown up by a bunch of people. Like we have a bunch of infrastructure and any of those infrastructure providers could shut us down. We are not censorship resistant, but we are non-custodial. So if those people were to shut us down,
you still have
your funds are still available. You still have your funds. The cool thing is, as soon as you let go of this idea of censorship resistance, you can just build good apps. And yes, it will be sad if someone comes and blows it up and it's no longer available, right? But everyone's funds will still be there. And the reality is...
Today's guest is Kain Warwick, the founder of Synthetix and Infinex. Synthetix is a derivatives protocol that he founded in 2017, and Infinex is a crypto app supported by Solana and other EVM chains that he founded in 2023. I'm excited to have Kain on the show today to talk about these companies, DeFi, the state of DeFi, the narratives he's following, and everything else in between. Kain, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Excited.
Thanks for being here. I literally struggled so hard saying your company names once we were on air, but I could promise that I will pronounce these correctly throughout the rest of this episode. Yeah.
Easy. No problem.
Start off, Kain. Can you tell us how you even got into this space years ago and what really drew you into it?
So I came from like an e-commerce background. So I was interested in payments. I was interested in like any weird tech stuff. And so the first time I came across Bitcoin, I was very much looking at it through a payments lens, which, you know, it was also looking at itself through a payments lens back then. Yeah. And then we set up Coinbase Commerce for one of my e-commerce businesses. And I think like maybe one person used it in the space of like 2 or 3 years. And then I set up another payments company later, and a friend of mine who I'd known from that time had started a company called CoinJar. And he was like, hey, we're having issues with the banks getting debanked. It's a crazy story what they used to have to do to keep their banking relationships. And I was like, well, I've actually got this network that you guys might be able to use where people can buy crypto with cash, because we were letting people deposit cash into other apps. And so we set up that relationship, and that was what kind of got me really thinking about the space on a daily basis, you know, as part of my, I guess, business and career.
Yeah. And that was 2017, or was that before then?
No, that was like 2015.
Oh,
that was
wow.
like 2015.
Okay. So what'd you do for those 2 years? Yeah.
Well, we were just building that company. So we built it up. I think at the peak in 2017, we were doing about $30 million a month in volume. That was like people bringing $30 million worth of cash into these networks to buy Bitcoin. And at that point, we'd expanded to ETH. I think we also supported XRP and a couple of other tokens as well. So, that company went really well. But I kind of got ETH pilled somewhere along the line around the DAO hack. And I sort of combined my e-commerce experience and the experience that I'd had in crypto up to that point, and thought, stable coins really feel like the thing that's going to be, huge, right? It's going to be one of the first use cases, because you've got this, sort of bearer asset, but it's volatile. If you could have a stable version of it. And at this point, Tether was the only option. This is, prior to Circle and Paxos and TrueUSD. And so I had this idea for creating a stablecoin network called Haven, which we started in 2017.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I feel like the stablecoin narrative is still so strong today. But the use case is there. It's very obvious. And I see it as a safe haven. So that's funny. Is that why you named it Haven?
Yeah, it was this idea of like, a place where you could have stability inside of crypto. So you get all the crypto properties, but also, stability. So it's funny the way that the stablecoin narrative has evolved though, right? Like back then, 2017, 2018, it was very much driven by solving the centralization problem of Tether. So Maker, Basis, Flamingo, there were a bunch of different decentralized stablecoins that popped up. That was kind of that first wave. But alongside that, Circle and TrueUSD launched. And I think most of us who were building decentralized stablecoins were kind of caught offside, because we were like, oh, we're fighting Tether. And Tether is this centralized, opaque thing. And then all of a sudden Circle's like, we're open and, transparent. We're still centralized, but at least we're like semi-regulated, which was a big competitive threat, I think, at the time.
And then what made you decide to move on from that to start Synthetix?
Well, so Haven actually transformed into Synthetix.
Oh, okay.
So, we realized we were like, this is not going to work. Like, we're not going to beat Circle here and TrueUSD. And I think actually TrueUSD was probably at the time felt more competitive. They were very aggressive with like partnerships and going and, approaching exchanges and, trying to supplant Tether. And so we spoke to a bunch of people, and one of the things that came out was the fact that there was no way to get exposure on Ethereum to some of the larger cap assets like Bitcoin. So talking to dexes like IDEX and Ether Delta and places like that, they were like, if we could have a Bitcoin token, that would be super cool because we now have these dexes, but we can only trade ETH and the ETH coins. And so we launched a synthetic version of Bitcoin that tracked the price of Bitcoin in late 2018.
And that's where the name came from. So that was
the transition. Yeah, that's where Synthetix came from. Yeah,
that's so interesting because is that where synthetic Bitcoin came from too? Was that the first of it, or it was like already a conversation?
It was a conversation, but we were, I think, one of the first. I don't want to say the first because a lot of people were doing a lot of weird stuff back then. But I think we were one of the first to launch a synthetic, Bitcoin. This is prior to like wrapped Bitcoin, right? Just the kind of Bitcoin collateralized Bitcoin tokens. So a bunch of people launched those much later, like into 2019, 2020. But we had a period of time where on dexes, that was the way to get exposure to Bitcoin.
Do you still think that's like a pretty high in demand form of Bitcoin today, like a synthetic Bitcoin, or is it more wrapped or just straight up Bitcoin?
I think the lesson from that era is that it is very hard to maintain price stability and also confidence in users when you have a purely synthetic asset. You can do it. It's hard. It takes a lot of time and Lindy. And people are just inherently more comfortable with the idea of some custodian, so BitGo in the case of wrapped Bitcoin, right, is holding the Bitcoin, or Coinbase even better, right, like CBBTC. Coinbase is holding the Bitcoin. They're good at holding Bitcoin. They tend to not lose it, and so you probably trust that you can redeem those wrapped tokenized versions of Bitcoin for actual underlying Bitcoin at some point. And once you have that trust, then you don't actually need to do the redemption. You can just trade that as if it were Bitcoin. It doesn't have all of the properties of Bitcoin because now you're reliant on Coinbase existing on the Ethereum network. There's a whole bunch of other, security considerations when you have wrapped assets versus just native Bitcoin on the Bitcoin blockchain. But it is a very good proxy for Bitcoin and a very convenient one.
Okay. And then how did Infinex come out? And also, why are the names so similar? Was that kind of like let's move them together?
So it's funny. So when we were spinning out the front end of Synthetix, so we had this Synthetix exchange, and we had constantly had trouble prioritizing it because Synthetix being a full stack application, we were building contracts to support the synthetic assets and constantly innovating and working on those. But then you needed an interface for people to actually utilize the platform, right? And that was an afterthought for us always. And so the interface always lagged behind the contracts. There'll be features missing. And we had this idea, probably I had this idea of what if we spin this out as a separate project and then they can manage this. And so at the time when we proposed it to the community, we said, well, we need to name it something. It doesn't make sense to call it Synthetix Exchange if it's now its own separate thing. We need to disambiguate them. And so a bunch of names were proposed, and two of the main names were Infinex and Quenta. And Quenta won, and I was always a bit annoyed because I liked it.
So it was Quenta.
Well, so Quenta won, right?
Yeah.
So the front end was spun off and became Quenta, and Quenta was the primary interface to interact with Synthetix. And then in 2023, I was like, I think that there is another approach that we should take to building an interface for something like perps. And so I was like, well, let's dust off the Infinex name, which lost back in the day, back in 2020.
You didn't forget that one, yeah.
I didn't forget it. I don't forget things.
Yeah.
I didn't like that lot. So I was like, all right, I'm going to run it back.
Yeah, amazing. I think a question I have for you on this front, and we'll definitely dive into like the whole DeFi narrative and everything that's going on there. But in terms of your founder journey, you have been a prolific founder for a long time. How do you think about, okay, this is a problem I want to solve, or this is a market that I want to tap into? Kind of walk us through like your journey as a founder and how you think about things. Because it's very rare that you see someone in this position, I think.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, in the case of Infinex, I will be honest, it was not my intention to found something else.
Just happened.
Right. It just happened. There's a bit of a winding journey of how I got here, but I had someone who was working in my family office who was sort of an entrepreneur in residence, and young, really smart guy. And I was like, hey, I've got this little project for you to take on.
Right.
And so he was like, yeah, okay, I'm excited. Let's do it. And the idea was really simple and straightforward. Build a centralized wrapper on top of Synthetix. And this was, around about the time when Hyperliquid was just kicking off, right? And so I had this view that the issue that we had for the last 5 years was that we had tried to build dApps purely decentralized through the whole stack. And the problem with that was you had a decentralized infrastructure and backend, but then a decentralized front end that was not performant, not very useful, and it was a bad compromise. And so if we put a centralized wrapper on top, you still get the properties of decentralization at the lower layer, but you get all of the properties of a modern app stack that you would expect from a Web 2 project. And so I was like, we'll build this. It'll take 6-8 weeks and wrap it up, and and here we are 2 years later.
Yeah. So is he still working with you?
He is not, unfortunately.
Yeah.
No. It was one of those things where it really did get out of hand, and he was very young. He was in his early 20s, and by the time we got like 25 staff, it was like he was just like, this is, it was a lot, right? Like it was just like and so I basically got to a point where I was like, you know what? I created this monster. I need to actually come and wrangle it. And so, I was like, all right, I'll step in and actually run it, because it really did just get, it got out of hand quickly because the opportunity was so much larger than we realized.
Yeah.
That, if you take that very simple thought of like, put a centralized wrapper on top of just a perps protocol, what if you put a centralized wrapper on top of every single DeFi protocol and really optimize for UX? And then what if you don't make it centralized? Which seems like it's an easy question to ask, right? But the implementation detail on that one is challenging. Yeah. So again, here we are 2 years later.
Yeah. For our listeners who don't know, can you explain what centralized wrapper is?
So you have a set of contracts running on Ethereum. And the cool thing about those contracts is you deploy them. So Uniswap V1 was deployed 6.5 years ago, or whatever it is.
It's like V4 now. Yeah.
Yeah, but it just runs. It runs. As long as the Ethereum network is still live and producing blocks, it just runs, and no one needs to do anything about it or think about it or whatever, right? Anyone can access it. They can access it a bunch of different ways through a bunch of different interfaces. So that's an amazing property of software that's running in this, world computer that no one needs to maintain. As long as validators are producing blocks, it just runs. Okay, but how do you make it easy to do things with those contracts? And this is the hard part that we struggled with for a long time with dApps, I think, right? Is we were trying to build these interfaces, which someone does need to maintain. They're hosted somewhere. They need to be on AWS or something like that. And so the idea was build an interface that has no compromises, that is not trying to be decentralized, is not trying to be censorship resistant, because the contracts are censorship resistant. So if you think about it, let's say in the case of Uniswap, you built a modern mobile app, which Uniswap is doing, right? That lets you access the contracts, lets you do things, lets you do trades or whatever. If someone were to come along, a nation state, and say you can't do that anymore, and shut down that mobile app, or Apple were to come along and say, actually, we don't like crypto, shut down the app, the contracts are still there. The contracts are still able to be used. You just can't use that interface.
Yeah.
And so this is like a very kind of important logical leap that I struggled with while I was building dApps in the early days. And I was like, actually, if you have a bunch of front ends, some of them can be centralized and it's fine, as long as they are non-custodial. And so this is the real distinction, right? And so what I mean by non-custodial is if you are using that interface, the person who's hosting the interface doesn't have your money. This is not a centralized exchange. This is not Binance, right? You don't have to give your money over. You still maintain custody of your own assets. But if the App Store nukes the thing, you still have your money. You just can't use it anymore, which you might be sad about. You might be like, but I liked that interface to those contracts, and I don't want to go back to connecting directly via Etherscan. But you're not going to lose your money. The contracts are still there. The world goes on, right? And so this is an important distinction in the solution space. I think that as a dApp developer for a long time, we were trying to optimize too much for censorship resistance at the interface layer. And it's a really hard problem, and it's an impediment to adoption. And so it's better, this is my current belief, right? It's better to build a thing that will get adoption, because adoption is the most powerful antidote to censorship.
Yeah, I agree.
And so get mass adoption, and then it's hard to censor a thing, because if the App Store tries to nuke it, the people using the App Store will be like, whoa, why are you doing a bad thing to me? I like this thing, right? And now you've got some, whereas if you're this niche little thing that no one cares about, the App Store can be like, delete. And no one will ever notice, right? And so the key thing is to get mass adoption. And to get mass adoption, you have to optimize for usability, because what we have not been optimizing for in the dApp world is usability. I mean, anyone who's used a dApp knows that.
Yeah. That's very true. I was going to ask you about that. Do you think that's kind of the state of other dApps out there then, is that they're not approaching this from the right lens, and they're kind of coming at it from the opposing side, where it's like they're going to create something and then assume the users will come, but it should be you create something that users want and then it grows with it? Does that make sense the way I'm phrasing it? Remember trying to move your assets between chains, watching the minutes tick by, wondering if your transaction would make it? Yeah, we've all been there. But here's the thing. While other bridges feel like taking the scenic route, Across is your express lane. Base, Arbitrum, Optimism, boom, boom, boom. Your assets move between them faster than you could say cross-chain. Across isn't just another bridge. When Uniswap needed the fastest, most reliable way to move assets cross-chain, they chose Across. Now, millions of Uniswap users are swapping between chains without even thinking about it, because that's how it should be. Whether you're moving assets yourself or building the next big thing in crypto, Across makes cross-chain feel like the same chain. No more scenic routes, no more complexity, just 2-second transfers between chains. Ready to join the express lane? Head to across.to and experience what bridging should have been all along.
It does. And I'll maybe put this through the frame of a story.
I love stories.
So my friend Robert Leshner started Compound. And one of the things that he said from the beginning, which I always thought was like very aspirational, but very aligned in terms of ideologically aligned with what we were trying to do. He's like, look, we built Compound. The contracts are amazing. We've done all of this work to build this amazing infrastructure for borrowing and lending. But the interface that we have built is just a proof of concept. We don't expect people to use it. We expect that a bunch of different people will turn up and build their own interfaces that will be far better than ours, and therefore we haven't put that much effort into it. And yeah, it's janky, but don't worry about it because this is permissionless technology and anyone can turn up and build their own interface to it.
Did that work out?
And no, of course not. No, like why would anyone do that?
Okay,
like,
that's
no, it's crazy.
That's
right?
what I thought.
And so like 7 years later, like, one person, Instadap built this interface that allowed you to like do stuff with different lending protocols, Compound and Maker and stuff, right? But like one team in India one time built Instadap. Other than that, no one ever built any other interfaces until today. And this is the interesting thing, because building an interface at the time for a dApp, there was no kind of competitive advantage to doing that. There was no way to capture users because of the way that dApps are architected. Today, now that we've kind of moved on from that posture, I think there are a lot of projects like Infinex that are trying to kind of own the user, have the user come to their mobile app or their interface and have an account and do things that allow them to interface with the contracts. And so finally, 8 years later, Robert's getting his wish, but it was a lot of pain and suffering in between.
Yeah, that's a long journey to deal with pain and suffering.
Really? I mean, that's
hey, everyone's got their every crypto founder is experiencing that in one way or another.
Exactly.
That's I was going to ask you about your founder journey. Like, would you do it all again, especially within this industry? And if so, what would you do differently, if anything?
So I had started, I think, either started or been like first 5 employee in 5 or 6 startups by the time I started Blue Shift, which was the payment network that like really got me deep into crypto. And up until that point, up until about, I think 2016, I was a really bad founder. Like,
why?
Because the way that I was approaching things, I would try and brute force everything, right? And I had some good properties, right? Like you want founders to have a bit of a chip on their shoulder and, something to prove because they need to kind of, be willing to prove the world wrong, right? That this thing that they're doing is a good idea, even when it's usually nonsense, right? And you can kind of brute force your way through it and adapt. And then eventually a lot of founders end up with something that actually is very useful to the world, right? If they stick with it and kind of fight through that process. For me, I had this realization, this kind of epiphany in like 2016, where I was like, the thing that I've been doing when something goes wrong is I will get frustrated that something's gone wrong, and I will try to fix the immediate issue, but not actually learn the lesson of, how did I make that incorrect decision? And something, I read a lot of startup books, and something in some startup book had finally landed. And I was like, the process itself is actually how you become a better founder. And so I really shifted my mindset from deal with the immediate impact of a mistake or an issue to understand the process by which that mistake happened and try and fix the process and process optimization and try and figure out what was the outcome, what was the outcome that we were trying to get and why did we not get it? And that shift in mindset combined with, having a chip on my shoulder and all of the other fun stuff, right, was what allowed me to really kind of improve both Blue Shift and improve how I was dealing with Blue Shift and learn things much more rapidly. Instead of being stubborn and being like, no, I'm going to do this, I would, be willing to kind of let go of a decision and say, okay, well, that decision made sense at the time, but we were missing information. We have that information now. Let's think about how we're going to do it. And so I really took that approach with Haven. And I think that's what allowed us to survive in 2018 in the bear market in a way that if I'd been doing, Haven in 2012, we wouldn't have. I think I would have just driven us off a cliff and it would have blown up.
Right.
But at the end of 2018, I was willing to sort of look at the world from first principles and say, okay, what mistakes have we made? What were we actually trying to solve? And what is the path forward? And that was what allowed us to make that pivot. And it wasn't just the pivot to synthetic assets. It was also a pivot in how the token was designed, which was a big part of this. Back then, and even today, although it's shifted a little bit, ERC20 tokens had a fixed supply. They were trying to ape Bitcoin and be like, all right, Bitcoin, the cool thing about Bitcoin is there's 21 million of them, right? Mm-hmm. And so ERC20 tokens will say like, oh, there's only 100 million of them and they can never change, right? Which A, was a lie, and B, didn't really make much sense. And so one of the big shifts that we made in 2018 was to change the token supply from a fixed supply to an inflationary supply. And that allowed us to put incentives in place that rebuilt the network and got momentum. And those sorts of things, being willing to kind of look at things from first principles and change my mind on things, I think were what allowed us to survive in a way that, again, as a younger founder, I would 100% have crashed and burned.
So what do you think about, because there are a lot of young founders in the space, and then there's more mature ones or the ones who are in between, but what about the young founders? Do you like watch them and think, oh, I've been there, or, oh, they're actually doing it better than I did?
Some founders do, right? Like, probably my favorite founder is Guy from Athena.
We had Guy on the show. Yeah.
Yeah. So I actually said to him the other day, like, he had, the greatest rookie season in the history of, crypto startups, right? And it's true. Like, I think that he identified a problem and he approaches problems from a very kind of systematic way. He's also an older first-time founder, right? Mm-hmm. He's not 22.
Yeah, he's had a career.
He's had a career. He's got some experience. Yeah. He's solved problems, solved real world hard problems, right? And so I think he's got a very good background and experience, but also he has the right mindset. He definitely has something to prove, and he has a bit of a chip on his shoulder, but it's not like diabolical, right? Like some young founders are like so stubborn, and I was one of them, right? Where I was so stubborn, I was like, I'm right, I'm going to do this thing, and letting go of that and realizing actually no one's right, and you're in an imperfect information environment, and it's really challenging, and you need to be adaptable, and just kind of locking in and driving towards a cliff at 100 miles an hour is not necessarily.
It's not going to offend you well.
No, but the funny thing is sometimes it works, right? Sometimes you get the funniest thing for me is like a young founder who's been successful first time out. That person is then a nightmare for the rest of time, right? Because they've been taught.
Because they think it's possible.
They think that's the way
this is how it goes.
Right? The world. Exactly. So, I mentor and work with a lot of startups and a lot of founders, and I find it really gratifying and hilarious at the same time because you get to sort of see the mindset that I had through a different lens.
Do you tell them to knock it off?
You know what? You can't
maybe in
really
a nicer way, or no? You just like watch them, and you're like, hey, I wouldn't do it this way. I would do it differently.
You have to guide. You can't tell a founder what to do. You have to sort of guide them.
Yeah, so that's true. Would you ever start another startup?
I certainly hope not. I really
this is it. This is it for you. Yeah. Unless you have another fun little side project that turns into a company.
I know. I think it is funny though. There is a part of me that's like, I've been doing software startups basically my whole life, right. From payments, early payments on the early internet, like starting in like 1999 all the way through. And they've been the through line, I think, with a lot of these startups has been very financial, payments, e-commerce, things like that. I do think if I were to start a startup, I'd want to do something completely different.
Outside of crypto?
Outside of crypto, outside of everything, like do like a hardware startup or something, right? Okay. That would be a novel challenge that I would be interested in, but my family would probably kill me. So,
Kain starts hardware startup. Family is mad. That's the headline.
Yeah, exactly.
Earlier on, you talked about user experience, and this is something that I feel like I discuss very frequently with guests on the show. User experience in crypto is just generally pretty bad. If I have an asset and I want to go then transact, it has to be within the network, and there's things that are it's just a mess. I think it's a conversation that we've been having for years across the industry, and it's gotten slightly better, but it's still, not where it should be. How do you look at user experiences, especially with like Infinex and everything? I know that's kind of important for you guys. And I also saw there's something called Swidge, which I thought was very smart, where essentially, for those who don't know, it's like swapping and bridging. I'm guessing that's where the name comes from. And so you could swap and or bridge from like one network to another. So like Optimism on Ethereum to Solana, correct?
Yep.
So that's a good user experience. How else do you think about user experiences?
It is a good user experience. And I think why have we been unable to solve the UX problem, right? And I think there's two ways to look at this. One, the UX problem is actually solved. Binance,
you think it's
Kraken,
good? Okay.
Binance, Kraken, Coinbase,
exchanges.
Great UX.
Yes.
Like there's no chains. You don't need to have gas. You don't need to know anything.
Just buy.
You have a login. You don't have to secure a seed phrase, right? Like you have all of this cool stuff. The only problem is it destroys the entire point of crypto because you're handing your assets to someone else.
You're like, you
right?
take care of this for me. Yeah.
The whole point of crypto is, and this like not your keys, not your coins mantra that's been going for a long time has been fighting a fight against a thing that you just can't win, right? Because Coinbase is just far better UX than what we have on chain. Okay, so we have good UX in crypto. They're called centralized exchanges, but the trade-off is really bad because if you happen to use the wrong centralized exchange, FTX, Mt. Gox, even Bybit recently, although they
great user experiences, yeah,
great user experience until it isn't, right? It's like 1,000 days in the life of a turkey, right? And so it's a very harsh trade-off that is sort of antithetical to what we're trying to do. But the UX is there, right? So we actually did solve UX just with bad trade-offs. The question is, how do we solve UX
with good trade-offs? Yeah. So we can have a great experience. Yeah.
Yeah. And it turns out you can, but you need to be willing to let go of some of the stuff, right? Some of the kind of ideological things. And the problem was that back in the day, early DeFi, we as DeFi builders were richly rewarded for doing things that were ideologically aligned.
Like what?
Right? Doing things that building interfaces that were very thin clients, that had no state, that were censorship resistant, that were pinned to IPFS, that would be there for the next 1,000 years, right? Unfortunately, 2 weeks later, they would break. And so it's just like the most nonsensical, insane thing to do. And it's like, yeah, job done, pin my thing to the
for 2 weeks. And, my job's done.
Yeah, and like 2 weeks later, and then someone comes back to use it 2 weeks later and it's broken.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, this is not it. Like, this is not the solution, right?
Yeah.
And so we were doing things for ideological reasons, for alignment, and doing things for enthusiasts. And the enthusiasts, the more crazy and difficult and obtuse the thing was, the more they liked it. Give them like 58 operations to execute to like get into a particular pool. Amazing. That's way better than 57.
Almost like a puzzle. Yeah.
Literally. And because the audience that we were targeting were enthusiasts and they wanted it to be weird and hard. That was the alpha, right? And so we built for those enthusiasts. And again, all of the early DeFi people did really well building with those incentives, right? Then we hit this brick wall where we ran out of enthusiasts. And you would think that we would say, there's no more enthusiasts. The market's saturated. What if we try and go and approach other people who aren't enthusiasts?
Right.
But we did not do that. That would have been the smart thing. Instead, we said, we're going to make more enthusiasts. We're going to train people to
love this space,
about the tech. And it's like, that did not work at all. It was horrifically bad. We maybe converted like 50 people in the world to our like crazy regime, right? And so we were stuck in this bubble for a long time where like, there's no more enthusiasts, we've tapped out, and everyone else was just using centralized exchanges. That's it. They just stayed on Binance or stayed on Coinbase or Kraken or whatever. And so the thing that we need to do, and the thing that Infinex has done, is said, okay, let's make some compromises. Where in the trade-off space do we want to play? And where we decided to compromise was on this idea of censorship resistance. So Infinex could be blown up by a bunch of people. Like we have a bunch of infrastructure and any of those infrastructure providers could shut us down. We are not censorship resistant, but we are non-custodial. So if those people were to shut us down,
you still have
your funds are still available. You still have your funds, right? So that was the trade-off space, decision that we made, right? Is to be non-custodial, but not to be censorship resistant. The cool thing is, as soon as you let go of this idea of censorship resistance, you can just build good apps. You can build a full stack application that has all of the stuff that you would expect with databases and, has state and all of the modern Web 2 stack that everyone loves in the normal internet. You can just build that. And once you build that, then it can do things, and it can do things really easily. And yes, it will be sad if someone comes and blows it up and it's no longer available, right? But everyone's funds will still be there. And the reality is, probably no one's going to do that.
Yeah.
Probably not, we were solving for such like a narrow edge case of like, what if a nation state decides to like take down the Aave interface? And it's like, bro, like, what are you talking
solving
about?
Solving for paranoia.
Like they're just, and this comes from the kind of crypto cypherpunk ethos, which I'm here for. Like I'm here for that. But the solution to that, genuinely, like if the world decides that crypto is a thing that it wants to kill, right? And it wants to shut us all down and we all have to go underground, we will be able to cobble together interfaces ourselves to be able to access these smart contracts, right? Like, smart contracts will still be there. We'll be running validators in basements hidden away. Like, but that's like that weird dystopia thing. Like, it's just not going to happen. Like the world has moved on from that, right? Like we've gotten through whatever inflection point that was where there was a potential that the world could shut us down. The world's not trying to shut crypto down now. It's been adopted by TradFi. Like it's our job now to kind of co-opt TradFi and co-opt the rest of the world and crypto pill them and explain to them why crypto is good. No one is coming to shut us down. The dystopia thing that we were worried about in the early days is not happening. So how do we make sure that we get mass adoption so that it becomes even less likely that anyone will be able to shut us down? Build good stuff. It's really straightforward. Just build useful, good applications that are easy to use for everyone, not just enthusiasts. And so that's what Infinex is trying to do. And there are a bunch of people, I think, that are also trying to do this, that have seen this as the kind of next thing that we need to do. I think we were lucky that we saw it earlier and we were able to kind of run at it faster. And I think we've made a lot of progress there. So I feel very good about where Infinex is positioned for the next, 3, 4, 5 years.
I do feel like there was a point, I'm based in America, and like the past administration, it just felt like there was this mentality of, oh my God, they're going to shut us down. And if they don't, they're just going to sue us into oblivion. And then we can't afford it. And that is us essentially dissolving these crypto companies. And then also, so I'm curious your take on that with the regulatory environment. Things have shifted, at least in the US. And I think globally things are starting to look up. But how do you kind of perceive the situation on that front? And then you also brought up apps that people want to use. Outside of the crypto space, what do you think those apps entail? Do you hate your PR firm? Then listen up, because this ad is for you. This episode is sponsored by 72B, a boutique public affairs firm founded by a former Coinbase comms manager. If you're sick of your toxic relationship with your public relations firm, break up with your agency and get better issue positioning, executive profile building, and more with 72B. Check them out at 72b.io.
So to answer the first question about regs, right? There was a period of time where I think many of the early DeFi builders were very naive, including myself, right? And we're like, our job here is to educate regulators. They just don't quite get what we're doing, right? They want the same thing as us. They want fair, transparent, efficient markets. Right? We want that we love markets. Like, we're your friends, guys. And then there was a moment in time in 2021 or something like that, where I think we all kind of woke up and we're like, actually, they hate us.
Well,
like the people in power.
It's also around the FTX time too.
Which didn't help, right?
Yeah.
But I think that this was a thing that was bubbling under the surface, and we were ignoring the signs that like, this is not an education problem. They know what we're doing and they
These
don't
are not
like
our
it,
friends,
right?
yeah.
No, they're not our friends. And so I think there was a moment in time in like 2021, 2022, where suddenly I realized, I'm like, oh, this is actually a pitched battle and these people are trying to kill us.
Yeah.
And that shifted it for me. It went from, I don't need to educate them. They know what we're doing. We actually need to try and fight back. Right. And I think that moment in time was a really, really critical thing for crypto. Now, to be fair, the dystopian view that like crypto was going to have to go underground, I think that had long passed, right? Just because the SEC was suing exchanges and doing all of this dumb stuff didn't mean that crypto was going to die, right? Like, crypto is this global phenomenon. You weren't going to be able to kill it. You may be able to suppress it, but you certainly weren't going to be able to kill it at that point. But so we didn't need to be optimizing for some of the things we were optimizing for. But yeah, that moment in time in 2022 where it was like, no, we actually need to start shooting back. Like, we're bringing flowers and books
like,
to explain.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, like we got to pick up a gun and start firing back at these guys.
Yeah.
And I think we did, and I think we won. And I feel very happy about that. A bunch of people, including Coinbase, were like, no, we got to take the battle to these guys, and went to court and fought them and won, including Ripple, and didn't just roll over and settle. And I think the funny thing about that is that the SEC became emboldened by going after a lot of projects that were not well funded. And they were like, we can wipe these guys off the face of the earth. And then unfortunately, they took on a couple of people that were like, no, we're actually very well funded and we are going to fight back.
Yeah.
And the whole thing just started to unravel. So yeah, I think from a regs perspective, that's kind of the trajectory. In terms of apps and what people want to use, it's funny because it does kind of come back full circle to stablecoins. Stablecoins are just one of the most useful things. The interesting thing about payment networks is network is in the name, right? Network effects are incredibly powerful. And one of the challenges that I think we have had in crypto and building payment networks is you need a closed loop to be able to make it work, right? If you go back to the early days of credit cards and where it came from, and this idea that there were people going to restaurants and they wanted to be able to pay at a restaurant and have, the ability to prove that they had funds, but without, writing a check that all of that stuff, right? And not having to bring, a sack of cash with them if they're going to go buy a nice bottle of wine or whatever. So you need the people on the other side. It's not enough to have a bunch of people with a credit card. You need merchants that are willing to accept it. And so you need that network effect where the more restaurants that accept it, then the more people that want to carry it. And it builds up slowly over time and can kind of take over the world, which credit cards did, right?
Yeah.
We haven't solved the merchant side of this equation, right? We have a lot of people who hold crypto, who have crypto apps, who have the ability to pay with stablecoins. The merchant side has been the missing component here, and different people have tried in different markets to make this work. In the nicest possible way, it's a harder thing to do than it was back then. You're competing with checks, like checks are really dumb. Like that's not hard.
Yeah, you're competing with paper.
It's not hard to win that one, right? Like, so competing with checks was not a difficult battle, right? But competing with, Venmo
and Apple Pay and all these other things.
Yeah, like that's harder. And so I think it's a harder prospect. And we're going to need to find the right point to inject ourselves into. But eventually someone will nail this and the network effects will kick off and it'll just become obvious that you should use stablecoins.
Yeah, I think that's something I definitely agree with. And you've been in the DeFi space for a very long time. So a question I had for you as well on this front is like, how would you characterize the state of DeFi in 2025? What are the trends that you're following, you're interested in? Maybe stable coins included or aside, because we already discussed that. But like, what else are you watching that you think is worth paying attention to?
So I've been having this ongoing conversation with Kobe about this, right? And I think that the response to the financial nihilism, right? This idea of like meme coins and these pure attention games has definitely been a return to fundamentals. And so the question is then, what are the fundamentals, right? And And if you are just, and I'm not sure that I 100% believe this, right? But the thesis is sort of that if you are just moving around these nonsense tokens that don't do anything, that are self-referential, there's no way to break that out into the real world, right? And so you must find things that are real, right? This return to reality of cash flows and fundamentals, et cetera. And it's interesting because it's not just crypto. Like in meme stocks and zero DT options and all of these things, this financial nihilism has picked up in many different sectors of the economy, not just in crypto. And so there is a question of like, was this some kind of reaction to the death of the ZERP regime, right? And zero interest rates. Now you have real interest rates, and what does that mean? And this transitionary period. But the thing that I think we all started building in crypto for was to build better financial rails. And what finance does is efficiently allocate resources. That's kind of its primary goal. And so one of the things that I think finance has done very well is create markets for capital allocation in equities. But those are real companies that do things. You've got like Boom Supersonic, they're building planes, right? It would be weird if it's like, we're just going to be trading a meme coin about a plane, but not like trading the equity of the guy that's making the plane, right? And so this is like this idea of like, did we just collectively lose our minds for a couple of years, and do we need to find a way to kind of come back to reality, right? And I think that we're seeing that with like the real world asset phenomenon, and people trying to find ways to connect into TradFi. There is this return to normalcy, or at least an attempt to return to normalcy. The cool thing about that is that all of the infrastructure that we built is just as good for trading tokenized equity, right? Tokenized coin on Base, for example. It's just as good at doing that as a meme coin. That's the nice thing, right? Like once you have this, once you can support tens of thousands of transactions, and huge liquidity pools, you can really easily remove financial nihilism and replace it with fundamentals, right? Like you just swap them out and go, okay, we're good. So that will be an interesting question for us, I think, over the next couple of years. Is like, does this pick up, and do we get momentum there?
What's Kobe's counter argument to you?
His counter argument, well, I mean, he's I think the one who's sort of saying that none of this stuff is real, right? Like all of these tokens are insane, right? All of these governance tokens of all the DeFi projects and everything, like none of that is
they serve a purpose,
real.
But
well, he's sort of saying like, until you actually interface with the real world, none of this infrastructure is important. Right? It's only it only makes sense if it's self-referential and inside this little bubble, and that's what it's only relevant
to the bubble. Yes,
it's only relevant to the bubble. Like you gotta be like, okay, and again, we're seeing that like tokenized coin. There's mass.money. There's a few projects that are like, what if we trade Tesla shares, right? Or like, what if we do this? And funnily enough, Synthetix tried to do this. But there was a period of time where that was an insane thing to do, and you would have been nuked from space. And we were like, we just slowly backed away from that idea. But today, it's easy to contemplate this idea that you could have tokenized equities and also structured products and, lending and things like, but not lending to leverage more nonsense tokens, right? Lending to fund, invoice factoring for a business that actually does like stuff
normal
to
things,
make them more efficient. Normal things, right? Like, and you know, so the funny thing is, I'm not sure that I completely buy this, but that could be because I'm just insane, right? And I do like the nonsense bubble, and so it's a little hard for me to let go of it. I'm like, well, this is still good, right? Like, so
I'm with you.
So I'm not quite Kobe pilled on this idea, but I'm getting there. I'm getting there.
Fair enough. Kain, last question for you, or request is, can you leave us with a piece of advice, something that you've carried with you throughout your time in this industry? And it's been some time.
Yeah, it's been
Quite
a
some
long
time.
time of building.
Yeah.
Yeah, a long time of building things. A long time of startups. A long time in crypto. The thing that I always say is you have to have conviction. You have to find your conviction, and if you have conviction, then it's far easier to kind of absorb the volatility of crypto. And on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis. So finding the conviction that keeps you here and keeps you building or keeps you investing or keeps you participating is the most important thing. If you have that, everything else falls into place.
Yeah, I love that. I agree with you on that 100%. Kain, thank you so much for coming on today. It was a pleasure.
Thanks. Appreciate it.